Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College, a program that encourages discussion in our community on today's local and global issues. Now your host for Conversations from St. Norbert College, author, professor, and nationally known sports economist, Dr. Kevin Quinn.
Welcome to Conversations from St. Norbert College. Our special guest is Wisconsin author J.F. Riordan. We'll discuss her books and the art of writing novels. So the art of writing novels, that's what you're doing these days, but you didn't start off that way, is that correct?
That is correct, and my first professional choice was to be an opera singer.
Wow.
And I did that for, still I guess at this point, the majority of my adult life, and I got tired of living out of a suitcase. I was in Europe a lot, and I just wanted to come home.
That doesn't sound so. You must own your own helmet with horns on it then, is that right?
Well, I never sang Wagner, which is where the quintessential horned helmet would appear, but I sang a lot of Mozart and Richard Strauss and a lot of operetta. I was, as you might imagine, I was always the small maid or ingenue, or the little girl Gretel and Hansel and Gretel, things like that.
You mentioned Wagner. One of my favorite lines of Mark Twain's was that Wagner's music is not as bad as it sounds.
Actually, his father-in-law, who was Franz Liszt, actually said that he had wonderful moments and excruciating quarter hours. So
that is great. So how did you wind up being a writer? Do you just wake up one day and say, boy, I want to write that great American novel?
Well, oddly, kind of I did, but before I got to that, I guess I've always had been a writer, but I was more of an essayist than a novelist. Although when I was a very little girl, I did two things that were perhaps indicative. I sang myself to sleep every night, and I would walk home from school telling myself stories, so out loud.
Wow.
So I guess those two things sort of came out later. But I actually did one day sort of sit down and just start writing. I had no plan to write a novel, but the first few chapters of the first book, North of the Tension Line, were all one sitting. They just came out in maybe, 5-6 hours, as if they'd already been written in my head.
That's amazing, because you hear people talk about, that blank sheet of paper is the most daunting white space on the planet, and to be able to have that come out means something. So how did you know that you were a real writer? Was there a moment where you just said, oh my gosh, this really happened?
Well, the moment when you know you're a real writer is when you get the email from the editor at the publishing house saying, we'd like to offer you a contract. That's the moment. Up until then, you are plagued with, at least I was plagued with, all kinds of self-doubt. It took me 8 years to write that first book, probably because I really didn't know if anybody would want it in the end. So there was no massive incentive to keep a schedule of writing. It was only through the encouragement of my husband, who kept saying, this is a book, that I actually finished it.
Did he read all the drafts in their raw form? Or?
Well, I don't write in drafts. I almost take notation. I see a film in my head and I write it down. And so, he saw things after I was finished with them, but they come out pretty cleanly, because I think of myself almost as a note taker in many ways, because I'm just transcribing the vision.
Well, that really shows, and I actually want to talk about some of the characters and the storylines in your books in a minute, but so you live in the Milwaukee area, is that right?
I do.
And you write about Washington Island.
Mm-hmm.
And what is it about Washington Island that drew you?
That place cast some kind of a spell over me from the first moment I was on the ferry. It was maybe 25 years ago, and I remember standing at the railing and seeing, first you see Detroit Island and Plum Island, and you're coming up, and Washington Island is off in the distance, and there's just this moment where I felt, this is where I belong. And I've spent the rest of my life in exile, really. So I think I probably wrote the books as a way of pretending that I'm actually still there.
That's actually a great idea. So for those viewers that aren't sure, Door County, which is where Washington Island is sort of our Cape Cod. And Washington Island is at the very tip of the Door County Peninsula, and it's pretty isolated, right?
It's about 4 miles off the tip of Door County, and it's a very small population, and it is... The title of the first book, which is now the title of this series, North of the Tension Line, is the unofficial slogan of the island. And I think it is because there is this phenomenon of you get there and you feel as if you've somehow fallen off the earth, and that everything else that goes on away from the island is extraneous and unimportant. And you do feel this incredible loss of stress. That is, I think, something that even people who live there still feel when they come back. I've had several residents tell me that they have the same experience every time.
Well, they think of Green Bay as sort of being the big city, right?
I suppose so.
Now, you're originally from the East Coast, is that right?
Yes, I was born on the East Coast. I am from a family of New Yorkers, but we moved to the Midwest when I was in second grade. So I think of myself as a Midwesterner, but there were some, and I think that sort of that East Coast pace and that East Coast elitism has always been sort of in the background of my mind, and in many ways I think my books are a Midwesterner's response to that.
Well, let's talk about the first book, so
Sure.
North of the Tension Line. Mm-hmm. All right, so you set the scene for us.
So North of the Tension Line introduces the main character, Fiona Campbell, who is a young woman escaping a high-stress life in Chicago where she was a reporter. And she comes to Door County to sort of start anew as a freelance writer. And she's kind of a city slicker. She doesn't fit in. And it's a small town there, too. And she's not from around there.
And it's Ephraim, right?
It's Ephraim. And one thing leads to another, and in a weak moment, she's goaded into accepting a dare that she can't survive the winter on Washington Island by herself. And she stomps off in a huff, and she buys this falling down wreck of a house, which is inhabited by all sorts of creatures. And at her housewarming party, somebody, Roger, gives her a goat as a gift, and she doesn't know what to do with it. And she has a horrible neighbor, and she doesn't fit in, and the people in the island are coming up with all sorts of stories about who she is and what she's really doing, none of which are flattering. And it's an exploration, I guess, of loneliness in some ways too.
That came through. I only had a chance to read this second book. I'm very much looking forward to reading the first one. But Washington Island is very isolated. You can only get there by ferry.
Yes.
And I guess in the old days, in the wintertime, or plane,
yeah.
In the old days, they would actually drive across that 4 miles if it was frozen, which sounds like a very hazardous thing.
And occasionally it ended in disaster, as you might imagine.
And it's right, Door County is called Door County because it was death's door, right? Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, so that passage between Washington Island and Door County is, the French called it the Door of Death, and I understand that the Indians had a similar term for it. I mean, as early as when the Potawatomi were living in that area, whole flotillas of canoes would go down because there are lots of shoals and irregular changes in the water depth, and the storms come up very suddenly across Green Bay and also from the north. So there are a lot of sunken ships, a lot of people lost their lives there. The French explorer Robert de La Salle was there on Washington Island, and his famous lost ship, the Griffin, left actually from Detroit Harbor actually maybe it was Washington Harbor on the island before it was lost. So long history of death and shipwrecks and disasters.
Yet the island, which is small, is inhabited by people from Nordic countries, Iceland, I think, primarily.
A lot
right?
of Icelanders. In fact, someone told me, and I haven't fact-checked this, but someone told me that it is the largest expatriate community of Icelanders in the world.
Well, they found the only place that was just as cold as the place they left. I think that's
That might be true.
so let's talk a little bit about the characters. The characters are rich, they're fun. So Fiona. So I couldn't help but think when I was reading that there was probably some of you in Fiona. Is that accurate?
I have to say pretty definitively not. Although, psychologists like to say that we're all the characters in our dreams. So I suppose in that respect, I'm all the characters in my novel too. So I guess I would say I'm just as much Roger or Stella, God forbid, as I am Fiona.
Roger's a very interesting character. So Fiona's the protagonist, right? And in the first book, you mentioned she moves up there and kind of guts it out for a winter. And a Washington Island winter is something. In the second book, she's still there. And the thing that I found interesting is that the island itself is a character.
It is indeed.
It's a living, breathing thing. And you march through the seasons there, and I found that to be kind of a cool. I've been to Washington Island, and I found that to be a very cool place. There is a coffee shop called Ground Zero there.
In my book.
In your book. But there is a coffee shop in Washington Island, and when I was reading about this, I could picture this. Yeah. So tell us about Roger. How is Roger on Washington Island?
Well, he's still in Ephraim. Roger's still in Ephraim.
In the first book.
He is an MIT-trained physicist who is still a rather young man in his 30s, but has retired, and for reasons that no one really understands, but Fiona's theory is that he must have irritated someone important, because that's the kind of guy Roger is. He is rather short on people skills and has really struggles. I mean, he does try to understand other people, but it's almost as if it's a form of colorblindness in his personality. He's just unable to fathom the workings of other people's feelings.
So he doesn't respond when you ask him how he's doing and things like that, right?
He tends to have an air of more or less cold fury all the time, and no one really. Unless you are a regular, you learn to take it for granted, but the visitors, the tourists, really don't know how to handle his demeanor.
There's another character in the second book, it may have been in the first book too, I can't wait to read the first one, a little dog. And when we think of little dogs, and you are a dog lover yourself.
I am.
They're usually portrayed as these lovable little creatures. Not this one.
Piggy, to use one of my friend's memorable phrases, is a waste of fur. He is one of those small dogs, and I think we've all known dogs like this, who have been coddled to the point of world domination. They think that they own everything, and they become small furry tyrants, and he is one of those.
But one of the things I found interesting about that character is that in this small town, in this small community, Piggy is kind of accepted for who he is, right?
That's true.
And that's
I hadn't thought of that, but that's true.
That's very true of the other characters that are there. You talk about the sort of the not so nice neighbor, Stella.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about Stella.
Well, Stella is one of those people who probably was the mean girl on the playground from the first moment she set foot in kindergarten. She is a native islander, and she resents everything about Fiona. She resents the fact that she's young and pretty. She resents the fact that she clearly has new friends on the island. She resents the fact, most of all, perhaps, that Fiona bought the property adjoining hers that Stella, had hoped to acquire. And she just has a chip on her shoulder as big as all outdoors.
And she's not a very pleasant person. We've all known people like that.
Well, yes.
But in this small community, she's kind of tolerated in a sense, right? Not beloved, but tolerated.
Not beloved, but tolerated, yes.
And a number of other characters. But when you write these books, do you sit and think about the characters and then imagine how they interact, or you think about the storyline and the characters sort of fill in?
It's more the latter. When I was an English major in college, I can remember authors saying that when they were writing a novel, that the characters would tell them what to do, and that they had nothing to do with creating the characters. And I thought, what a load of crappy crap, to quote Bart Simpson. But the reality is, in my own experience, that's exactly what happens. They do kind of, they are real to me. They're existing in an ether even when I'm not writing for me. And so it's very, like I said before, about being almost a note taker, they really are the arbiters of what they will and won't do and what seems appropriate for them.
Well, they just rang so true to me. I mean, anybody who's spent time in a small town or has understood what it means to live in a small town can maybe not recognize the individuals, but absolutely can recognize the type of characters.
And I want to take an opportunity to correct a misconception on the island. The characters are entirely fictional. They are not meant to represent anybody real. Only the island is the real place.
I was wondering that because
Yeah.
when you visit the island, I'm guessing that you're, part celebrity and part pariah for that. Because I'm Roger, I know I'm Roger, or I know I'm Elizabeth. Or
Well, I'm looking forward to the celebrity part, but that hasn't happened yet. But yeah, I do think there may be a little bit of pariah. I was at the bookstore up there in July for the first time, and a number of people came in speculating, well, is this so-and-so or is that so-and-so? And I had to have that conversation over and over again. I didn't know anyone on the island when I wrote the book, so there was no way that they could be real people. So unfortunately, I think often people see what they want to see.
But I think that also speaks to the authenticity of the characters.
I'll take that.
In your blog, and this really struck me, you in some points chronicle your car and how I think it's trying to tell you it's ready for retirement, or I forget it. You said it much better than that. But you had an opportunity to run into a tow truck driver.
Yeah.
And the fascination you had with him was chronicled very much the way you describe these characters. So talk about this tow truck driver.
Well, let me take, before I answer that, let me take it back a little bit. I realized after I had written the second book that what these books really are, now this was not my intention, it wasn't part of my plan, I didn't set out with some lofty goal of making some statement. But in reality, in this culture we live in of celebrity and reality television and everybody wanting to be on Instagram and everybody wanting to be rich and famous, these books are really they're really a tribute, I think, to the well-lived life of the ordinary person. The people in my books are passionate people, they're interesting, they're intelligent, they're creative, they have really wonderful lives, but they're not rich, they're not famous, no one will ever hear of most of them. And I think that's one of the great beauties of real life, that the dignity and the passion of everyday life is really what life is about. It's not about those culture of celebrity trappings.
So tell us about this tow truck driver.
The tow truck driver. So, it was funny because we all make snap judgments about people every day. And so I was really in a bind because my car had died and I was due up at a book signing in Door County, and time was of the essence. I had cut it a little thin. And this guy comes to pick me up, catastrophic car failure. And he's this young dude, and he's got a beard, and he's got a bunch of pierced things, and he's tattooed all over. And so immediately you sort of make this jump that this is someone who's into pop culture and perhaps not intellectually very serious. Very unfair judgment. I'm just telling you, this was the impact I had of this guy. And then, as we're driving to the shop with my car, he says to me, well, why are you here? And I said, I'm a writer. He said, I love books. Let me tell you how many, and he gets out his, he's getting out his iPhone or whatever it was, and looking up an app while he's driving down the freeway at 70 miles an hour, and I'm thinking, man, look at the road. But he's looking up on his Audible account how many hours of books he's listened to in the past few months, and it was some phenomenal number. So this guy is busily reading serious, what I would call serious literature, stuff that is thought-provoking and in-depth. And But he's also reading, sci-fi stuff, and he loved Harry Potter, and it was just not what you expect. And I love the idea of this guy riding around this sort of thankless job, really, the little back roads of in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, between Milwaukee and Green Bay, and listening to these great voices. And participating in this human conversation. It's so cool.
I think that's actually one of the cool things about Wisconsin. In fact, one of the things I just got a huge kick out of is that the people who come from the big cities, Fiona notwithstanding, don't come off very well.
No, they don't, do they?
One of my favorite was the two folks in the second book, the two folks from Chicago that had just moved in and opened up a goat farm, basically, right? A goat dairy.
Right.
And they're going to tell you about everything. Are people from Chicago really that bad?
Well, I probably not. But we're from Wisconsin. Our slogan is Illinois. It's beneath us. But I think anyone who deals with tourists, probably, and many of the tourists in Door County, as you know, come from Chicago and Illinois. I tend to develop a certain disdain for travelers. I think you can say this about travelers in general. People tend to be thoughtless when they're on vacation and not in their own backyards. And I think that's probably where most of that attitude comes from. It's also, the irony is, of course, that the Illinois people are also the bread and butter for the tourist industry. So there's a flip side to those relationships. You
seem to have really embraced the idea of going on book tours, book signings, and all that sort of thing. And often, and you seem to be very good at it, often people who like to write books have absolutely no interest in that element of the profession.
Well, they must be people who don't want to actually sell books. I have this weird quirk. I want to actually sell books. I want people to read my books. And in the publishing industry, my publisher is a New York publisher, but it's not it's an independent publisher. It's not one of the big conglomerates. And most big bookstores, aside from the lovely little indie stores, have the same kind of rules that grocery stores have. The big book publishers buy space in those bookstores for lots of money. I can't even imagine how much. So books like mine, even though Barnes & Noble has had events for me, and I'm grateful to them and I love that, I rarely see one of my books in a Barnes & Noble because you have to have the wherewithal to be able to put the books out there. So my approach is an approach that's kind of, I learned from reading about two authors who started as regional authors. One is the late Vince Flynn, and the other was Jan,
I was thinking about him too.
Jan Karen, and both of them started by building critical mass in their regions. And so that's my goal. I want people in Wisconsin to know that I'm here, and it's hard to get a foothold in the world. And frankly, to be totally blunt, I'd rather talk about my books or talk about writing than just about anything in the world. So.
Well, that comes through. Your love for that comes through. Yeah, Vince Flynn was a bartender, I think it was, in the Twin Cities, right?
I think he quit. He had some kind of, if I remember right, he had some kind of very high-powered job and quit it to become a bartender so that he could write novels and then literally travel with a trunk full of books in the trunk of his car and sell them out of his car.
He must have been persuasive, not
Apparently
to sell the books, but to convince his wife that was a good idea to do.
Yeah.
But it is the publishing business. I think most, I've had the occasion to do a couple of books, and it isn't what people think. It's not like you write this book and then all of a sudden you have this public relations machine that's behind. Maybe that's true if you're Henry Kissinger or something like that.
Yes, precisely.
Or if you're, any one of the really, really big time, Nelson DeMille or something like that.
Right.
But it's a different kind of experience. There are lots of books published all the time, and few of them have achieved the kind of success that you have.
Well, the first time I went into a Barnes & Noble for my first event, it was in Michigan, actually, and I remember walking in, and it was not the first time I'd been in a Barnes & Noble, but I walked in, and all of a sudden I was acutely aware of how many books there were, and how hard it is to get an audience, and that was the first time. I actually thought that too. I thought, I got a contract. My book is going to be published.
I'm done.
Woohoo! Here we're done. And it's not like that. It's actually more effort because it doesn't come naturally to want to go out and sell things if you're not, if that's not your orientation. So it's work.
It is work, and you talk about being on the road. I mean, people think it's glamorous, but I'm guessing sitting there and talking to people for 3 hours at a pop and signing a bunch of books is it's work.
Well, if you're signing a bunch of books, it's awesome. But when you come, pardon me, when you come to a library and 3 people show up for your book event, that's demoralizing. People talk about, I was humbled when I won the Nobel Prize. That's not humbling. Humbling is having, 3 people show up at your lecture and then having to sit down and sort of change your 30-minute speech into a conversation. That's humbling.
I can appreciate that. So people come up to you, I'm guessing, and talk to you about these characters like they're real living characters, and they want to know more about it. Is that right?
That is right. In fact, one of the really interesting things, and another thing that I wasn't prepared for, is that when you're writing the book, it's yours, and they're your people, and it's your world. And when the book is out there, people read it, and then it's theirs. It's not mine anymore. And so they have all these theories about things, and they want to discuss with each other. I mean, I've been at book club meetings where various members will get into these arguments with one another about, why Roger's the way he is, or what Elizabeth sees in Roger, or any of those kinds of things, and I'm just watching it like a ping pong match, and it's really interesting.
What does Elizabeth see in Roger? I had that question myself.
Well, I have always...
He's very handsome, right?
He is good looking, thank God for that, right? But I think it's really interesting, the mysteries in human relationships. I don't know about you, but I have many times in my life encountered a couple and think, what on earth goes on between those 2 people? I mean, how do they...
What does she see in him?
What does she see in him, or what does he see in her? And it's kind of mysterious and charming, I think. And so to me, that was just a little dose of reality.
Well, that was very cool. And I don't want to give away too much, but the arc in the Audacity of Goats, the arc of Roger expanding his horizons through yoga was absolutely priceless. That was worth reading the book right there. So I appreciate how you must have laughed when you were typing that stuff up.
I have to confess, I did laugh when I was writing a lot of that. And I have to give credit to a friend of mine who is one of those lovely, lucky people who every vacation she goes to some amazing yoga retreat somewhere in the world. And one day she called me on the phone. She'd just gotten back from some place in India or something. And she said, Jan, I had this amazing idea. Can't you imagine Roger doing yoga?
Oh, is that right?
After I finished laughing for about 15 minutes, I thought, yeah, Jody, that's a great idea. Roger has to take up yoga.
I just thought that, that was awesome. And the other part I really got a big kick out of is that the way that the guys are and the way that they interact with each other is kind of the way it works in a small town. I thought that was pretty good. And the other thing I have to kind of give away was there was a slam at roundabouts in Wisconsin, which anybody who's from Wisconsin know that every time there's 5 miles of road that they have to put a roundabout
in the middle of a cornfield.
In the middle of a cornfield.
Better yet, 3. 1, 2, 3, and there's no other traffic anywhere around.
Yes, yeah. which I thought was great. Well, I only have time for one more question, fortunately, which I knew this was going to go fast. But somebody who is an aspiring novelist, what's the advice? I mean, you're a success. What's the advice you'd give them?
I will give people the advice that I was given. When I was, as I said earlier, it took me a long time to write that first book and to slog through it. And I kept worrying, well, how am I going to ever get this book published? How am I going to get an agent? How is this all going to happen? And my husband would say to me, right now, none of that is any of your business, because none of it matters if you don't write the book. So just write the damn book. So that's my advice. Write the damn book. Worry about everything else later, because none of it matters unless you've actually written the damn book.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to reading the first one and the next one and at least one more after that. Is that right?
There will be at least 2 more.
I can't wait because I fell in love with the characters, in case you couldn't tell that. And thank you for being with us today and
Thank you, Kevin.
sharing your thoughts and your experiences here. And I hope all of you have enjoyed our show as well. Until next time, I'm Kevin Quinn. Best wishes for good conversations from St. Norbert College.